Spektrum Metrics has expanded our industry-leading web spectrum viewer to provide quick insights into spectrum allocations, carrier spectrum ownership, and network capabilities for those carriers in different countries. Now we're going to go ahead and explore another one of our countrywide analysis tools, which will detail how much of each of the spectrum bands is owned by different carriers, measured essentially by MHz-Pops, which is the amount of spectrum that a carrier controls over what population they control it. To do that, we're going to go ahead and start in the United States. And we're going to choose in the analysis menu, the MHz-Pops analysis tool. When we open this up, you can see a table for the 8 selected carriers that shows their MHz-Pops by low band, by our band classifications, low band, lower mid, and upper mid, and then total. Those are then presented in a bar chart, and what you can quickly identify is that the spectrum in the US is really dominated by 4 players. This reflects Dish's transactions with AT&T and SpaceX, so Dish normally would have been kind of a third of the other carriers, and it's much lower now. A second, besides along with the bar chart, we can also look at frequency band analysis. So now with frequency band analysis, we're looking at low band spectrum, and then we're able to see in the bar chart how much each carrier has. And essentially T-Mobile has roughly twice the MHz-Pops that AT&T has for the 600 megahertz spectrum. Let's go ahead and look at what we call national band ownership. So that's looking at spectrum on a national basis in terms of MHz-Pops. And when we look at that for frequency band, you can see that T-Mobile is controlling 47% of the 600 megahertz band, even with the Dish transaction included, where AT&T only has 22%. And does also identify that 29% of that spectrum is still in carriers' hands besides AT&T and T-Mobile. And then looking at those same pie charts, but now low band, T-Mobile's or AT&T's significant holdings in 700 megahertz and cellular come into the mix to basically allow them to have more spectrum in low band than than T-Mobile, when you look at it on an entire low band allocation. Verizon is somewhat equivalent to T-Mobile with 15%. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump over to another country. Let's just do these in order. So we'll jump into Mexico. The analysis menu, choosing MHz-Pops. It's already set for band classification. In Mexico, it's clear that the vast majority of the spectrum is in the regulatory body's control, and there really are only 2 carriers that are significant owners. Going into the national band ownership, looking at low band, we can see the 700 megahertz nationwide operator, PRM, and IFT and their unauctioned 600 megahertz spectrum kind of are weighted here, and then AT&T and Telcel each have about 10%. Back up to select frequency band analysis allows us to see that IFT controls all of the spectrum for 600 megahertz because it hasn't been auctioned, and PRM has all of the 700 megahertz that they won the entire band and have it configured as a 45 megahertz by 45 megahertz international configuration. The next country we're going to choose will be Germany. Choosing the analysis menu and MHz-Pops. Checking the filters to make sure that we're looking at national numbers, and we'll go ahead and look at band classification information first. So we see low, low mid, upper mid. And what this allows us to see is that there really are 3 national carriers in Germany. One of them, Telefonica, has slightly less than the other 2 carriers, and Drill doesn't have any low band spectrum. They're kind of about 30% of the amount of spectrum that lower mid, and probably close to about 30% of the upper mid. We'll actually be able to see those numbers here in a second by checking on the national band ownership. So for low band spectrum, Drill has no low band spectrum, but they do have 6% of lower mid and 7% of upper mid. And we can also see that Vodafone, Telefonica, and T-Mobile all have roughly 30% low band, 30% lower mid band, and 30% mid-20s for upper mid band. Going to frequency band, 700 megahertz, it's a perfect 30%, 30%, and then 24, 30, 24. The last country we're going to look will be Canada. Choosing the analysis menu, MHz-Pops. So in Canada, you really have 3 national carriers, Bell Mobility, Rogers, and Telcel, with a few strong regional players in terms of Freedom Mobile, Videotron, and ExploreNet. To look at their concentrations in each band classification. So low band, Rogers kind of has a dominant 31%, but Telus does have 16%. Bell Mobility also has 16%, so they're about half the amount of low band spectrum for each of those other carriers. And the detail for frequency bands is that Rogers has 41% of the 600 megahertz band. Freedom Mobile actually must have bid fairly heavily to get their 26%. And then Bell Mobility has 14% of that band. They have a stronger 700 megahertz ownership. So what we've just taken you through is the ability to look at each country and see each carrier's concentrations in terms of band classifications or frequency bands, and how that affects the performance of networks and the value of the companies in each of those markets. Thank you very much for watching this video.